welcome everybody on behalf of the LINC Programme this evening. My name is Emer and I'm the Dean of Early Childhood and Teacher Education here at Mary Immaculate College. So I would just like to extend a warm welcome to you all to our webinar celebrating International Children's Day. I would also like to thank you for your interest in being with us on this cold November evening and for taking the time to reflect on what we can all do to advocate for and raise awareness so that the rights of all children are protected and fulfilled without discrimination. World Children's Day takes place each year on the 20th of November. The day marks the United Nations General Assembly's adoption of the Declaration of the Rights of the Child as far back as 1959, as well as the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989, which we're all very familiar with. In 2024, World Children's Day calls on adults to listen to the future. We know that upholding children's rights is the compass to a better world today, tomorrow, and into the future. However, we also know that children's rights continue to be misunderstood, disregarded, compromised, and denied in so many global contexts. And indeed, here in Ireland, where, as we know, over 4,000 children are currently homeless. We have almost 400 participants registered for this webinar across so many sectors this evening, which is indicative of a growing concern to shape a better future for our children by acknowledging the rights to which all children are entitled and advocating for those rights to be realised for each child. The LINC Programme was established in 2016 and is delivered by a consortium comprising Early Childhood Ireland, Frebel Department of Primary and Early Childhood Education, Maynooth University. The LINC Programme and more recently the LINC Professional Learning Programme are designed to support early childhood teachers in their quest to create inclusive early learning and care settings where all children belong and diversity is the norm. And I just really like to welcome all of our current LINC students, especially all of our past LINC students here this evening. So from the outset, the LINC Programme has been underpinned by a concept of the child as a competent, agentic rights bearer and our responsibility as educators to respond in full to those rights continually highlighted through the programme. So we are absolutely delighted at LINC here this evening to welcome Professor Bronagh Byrne at the Centre for Children's Rights, Queen's University, Belfast, to remind us of our responsibility to children of all abilities. Professor Byrne has worked extensively on the application of international conventions, including the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. This evening, Professor Byrne will explore how all children are recognised as rights holders and focus on the importance of challenging assumptions that a cohort of children are solely in need of protection and care, while identifying ways to amplify the voices of marginalised groups. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Bronagh Byrne to share her presentation with us.
My name is Bronagh Byrne. I'm the co-director of the Centre for Children's Rights at Queen's University, Belfast. So I'm a profoundly deaf academic and I work very much in the area of children's rights generally, but also the rights of children with disabilities and inclusive education. Before I begin, just to let you know that I have a beautiful assistant dog in the background, a young dog called Robin, who is now off duty after working very hard all day. So apologies in advance if you do hear a dog barking in the background. She's probably just trying to include her opinion in this issue as well. This evening, I want to focus on ways in which we can give rights, voices and visibility to all young children, with a particular focus on children with disabilities. And over the next 40 minutes or so, I want to look at the journey to rights for young children with disabilities, and the principles that I am looking at this evening are equally applicable to all children, irrespective of the background that they come from. But I think looking at the rights of children with disabilities is a really useful lens through which we can look at the rights of all marginalised young children. So first of all, I want to begin by looking at some of the dominant social norms surrounding young children with disabilities. What do those norms look like and what do they tell us? Research often tells us that children in early childhood are excluded from rights discourse and perceived as not capable of having a voice. And this narrative has been particularly heightened when it comes to young children with disabilities. So I want to also look at the intersectionality of age and disability in early childhood. What does that mean when we are considering the experiences of young children with disabilities in early childhood, and what does it mean when it comes to understanding rights? It's really important to look at this from a rights-based perspective, looking at the extent to which young children in the early years are understood as rights holders. So I want to briefly look at ways in which we can disrupt those predominant protective narratives and assumptions of young children with disabilities as solely in need of protection and care. And then finally, I want to finish off by identifying some ways in which we can begin to give visibility to the voices of young children with disabilities. And I want to do that by highlighting a variation of the LINC model of participation. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the LINC model. I'm very conscious that this evening I am preaching to the converted almost, and most of you will be coming from a rights or autonomy-based perspective around young children generally. But I want to begin by unpacking some of the dominant social norms surrounding young children with disabilities. As we know, generally, there's been a norm or a narrative that children should be seen and not heard. And those norms have been rejected by the youth sociology of childhood, as many of you will know. The youth sociology of childhood has really increased the visibility and the volume of children's voices, disrupting traditional understandings of what an acceptable knower looks like, or rather what an acceptable knower, what age they should be. However, we also know this progress has not extended equally to all children. With a few exceptions, young children with disabilities, and particularly those with more complex needs, have neither been seen nor heard. There are also a number of predominant social norms that persist in relation to disability, and many of these still persist in today's society. There are assumptions that people with disabilities are a group who are solely in need of protection and care, that the emphasis should be on trying to find ways of fixing people who have disabilities or health conditions, focusing on curing them, making them better, and restoring them to some kind of normality. Now that obviously raises the question of what can we consider as normal? Who can we consider and understand as being normal in today's society? Many of these norms have begun to be very strongly disrupted by disabled people themselves, through the disability movement and through the field of disability studies led by disabled academics. We know that disability movements in countries across the world, the global disability movement, has played a key role in challenging understandings of normality based on some kind of notion of perfect health. And the people with disabilities are increasingly being given a voice. They're increasingly being given a seat at the table. And we can see that particularly, as I will discuss in a second, in relation to international human rights law. However, if we look at those assumptions and challenges more closely, the emphasis has largely been on adult priorities. When we discuss disability issues, people tend to think of adults with disabilities rather than children with disabilities. And there have been some exceptions to that, but predominantly, children with disabilities have been traditionally silenced by discourses of both disability and of childhood. There's been little room for children with disabilities to have a voice in either of these spaces. The sociology of childhood studies has focused predominantly on the mainstream child, while disability studies has focused primarily on young people or adults with disabilities. And there's been something of a silo effect, which has left little room for children with disabilities to nudge their way to the front, if you like. And instead, the experiences of children with disabilities have been represented by proxy, either through the perspectives of parents or of other adults in their lives or of professionals who are in their lives. And this has meant that children with disabilities have tended to fall between two schools, the mainstream child on the one hand and the adult with a disability on the other. As we know, children and childhood are not homogeneous. They have very different experiences. A young child will have a very different experience to an older child. We know that young children with disabilities experience double discrimination or double jeopardy on the grounds of both age and disability, which produces an additive form of discrimination. However, perhaps more importantly, and what I want to explore more this evening, is the importance of intersectionality. Young children with disabilities experience intersectional discrimination. They experience discrimination on the one hand because they are a child, on the other hand because they are an individual with a disability, but also in a distinct way as a result of the intersection between age and disability. And this is as well as all of the other identity categories that they may also be part of. Unfortunately, these multiple intersectionalities that children with disabilities can experience has been given relatively little attention when we compare it to other groups of children and other groups of people with disabilities. If we look at that more closely, we can see that the more complex, the more visible a child's disability may be, combined with the younger they are, then the less capacity they are perceived to have, and the more likely they are to experience discrimination on various grounds. In practice, we have all been guilty of viewing young children with disabilities through a single identity lens, through a monolithic lens. The identities of young children with disabilities can almost be viewed like a jigsaw puzzle. There are lots of different aspects to their identities. We might think we are able to identify those. We have all of the different pieces, but we're not quite sure how to put all of those pieces together and what the bigger picture looks like in terms of their experience. I want to move on now to look at the value of rights. Why do we need to bother with rights? If we all have very good intentions when it comes to children with disabilities and young children in particular, why do we need to consider rights? Why do we not just keep doing what we are doing anyway? Rights are absolutely critical. They're critical for a number of reasons, but in particular for the population group we are looking at this evening, they are really key in helping us get to the root of the inequalities, the discrimination and the oppression that they can experience. As Michael Freeman has argued, rights play a key role in making visible that which is being suppressed. It allows us to uncover assumptions and experiences that have been taken for granted. For example, we have long assumed that young children with disabilities are not in need of rights, that rights are irrelevant to them, that we should focus on their health, on trying to get them the right medical treatment or the right equipment, that the focus should be on their protection and their care. But taking a rights-based approach allows us to see beyond that. It allows us to see beyond the immediate experiences of the individual to look at the more structural and cultural factors at play. And ultimately, it allows us to disrupt the mainstream narrative that young children with disabilities are a burden on our society, a burden on the resources that we have. And I'm sure we've all heard that argument around resources time and time again when it comes to young children. The critical rights-based frameworks we need to be looking at are the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Ireland has ratified both. This is one of the quotes, the many quotes that I like, because I think it really hammers home the point as to why we need to think about and talk about rights. Jack Donnelly argues, human rights claims express not merely aspirations, suggestions, requests, or laudable ideas, but rights-based demands for change. We're very good at talking about aspirations, the aspirations for our children, at all kinds of wonderful ideas. But by talking about rights, we are talking about fundamental entitlement for all children. And through rights, we can call and advocate for change. I'm very aware that there is a significant and really exciting growing body of work happening in Ireland at the minute, whereby early childhood researchers are grounding their work in the UNCIC, they're actively using the UNCIC, and many of you who are here today are leading the way in that work and developing rights-based approaches. And that has been really, really fabulous to see all of the good practice that is emerging out of Ireland. What do rights-based demands look like for young children with disabilities? Well, children with disabilities generally were finally explicitly recognised as rights holders under the UNCIC in 1989, along with their non-disabled counterparts. And there are a number of rights across the CIC that are particularly relevant to them. All of the rights in the CIC are relevant and relate to young children with disabilities, but there are some particular rights I just want to highlight and I think are of particular significance. Article 2, the right to non-discrimination. That is significant because it's the first time a non-discrimination clause in an international human rights treaty has explicitly mentioned the word disability. Before that, people, adults, children with disabilities were categorised under the heading of any other status rather than explicitly recognised for their disability. So that's really, really important. Article 23 sets out the specific rights of children with disabilities in relation to support, in relation to assistance that they may receive. Article 12, which you're all very, very familiar with, the right of the child to express their views, and for those views to be given due weight in accordance with their age and maturity. And also, in the context of today and early childhood, Article 28 and 29 around the right to education. If we read all of those articles together, we can say that human rights law clearly requires that young children with disabilities are supported to express their views individually and as a group on all matters affecting them, obviously in accordance with their age and maturity. However, it's not a magic wand. It doesn't solve everything. And it is important to cast a critical eye on human rights discourse and how it works. Until fairly recently, I have been quite critical of the UNCRC and its traditional approach to children with disabilities. It has been guilty of reaffirming a rather medicalised approach to disability. So, for example, it talked about special needs rather than the general needs. It talked about the need for resources. It talked about support being offered as far as possible. So there have been a range of qualifying terms that have been used in the UNCRC. So it has been problematic in some ways. And more generally, and interestingly, there has been an absence of a specific focus on young children with disabilities. Yes, there has been a focus on young children. Yes, there has been a focus on children with disabilities, but there's been a lack of focus on those identity categories together. So what has the UNCRC committee said about children with disabilities, or young children in particular? Well, we can get some guidance across the general comments. And this is some of the commentary from the general comment on disability, which we produced in 2007. And I just want to note the timing of this general comment. We know the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was adopted in 2006. The UNCRC committee produced a general comment on disability the following year. So there has been some overlap and influence there. If we look at the general comment on disability, we can identify that it emphasises the importance of early intervention for young children with disabilities. It talks about the need for strong links to be established between early intervention services, preschools, and schools generally to facilitate the smooth transition of the child. It also talked about the systems in place and the way in which the systems in place need to be capable of including children with disability, that they need to be able to provide them with various kinds of devices and equipment and rehabilitation and treatment. Interestingly, there's an emphasis on the need for services to be efficient and the need to avoid long waiting lists and bureaucracy. And I'm sure we can all identify with that in terms of what is happening in Ireland and also in the UK more generally. On the rights of the child has also talked about early education, and it's acknowledged it's particularly important for young children who have disabilities. Once again, it's grounded in early intervention and early identification, and that is very clear from the language that we see from the general comment. But what I think is particularly important to note is we need to recognise that the system itself also needs to be adapted. The responsibility or the onus should not always be on young children with disability having immediate access to treatment or rehabilitation or devices, but we need to consider ways in which the barriers for young children with disabilities in the education system, in areas of early childhood and care, we need to identify those barriers and challenge the structural inequality that exists. In relation to the right to express views and have a voice, the right of young children to participate in decision-making processes, the committee has been very clear that this right should extend to both young children and those with disabilities, and therefore young children with disabilities. They've been clear that it should be anchored in the child's daily life at home, in the community, and in the full range of early childhood health, care and education facilities. In doing so, children with disabilities should be supported to use both verbal and non-verbal means of expressing their views. So that is very clear from the committee, and this is of particular importance because we know that young children with disability are most likely to be perceived to lack capacity to express any views. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This was adopted in 2006 and came into force in 2008. It's an interesting treaty because for the very first time, the population that was designed to be protected was actually part of designing it and developing it. People with disabilities were actively involved in deciding what rights should go into that treaty. The CRPD has been lauded for many reasons, but one of those reasons is its very clear recognition of the interaction between individual impairment, the environmental and the structural barriers. In other words, it is not just the individual health condition that we need to consider, but the way in which that interacts with the physical, the cultural, the attitudinal barriers that young child confronts in our society. In relation to children and young children with disabilities, there are a number of rights that are of specific relevance. The first of these is the reference to the evolving capacities of children with disabilities. Again, acknowledging that it has been very problematic for children with disabilities to be able to express their views. The right to non-discrimination is very clear within that. And Article 7 draws on the Convention on the Rights of the Child and, among other things, makes it clear that children with disabilities have the right to express their views, but also to be provided with age and disability-specific support, something that's not covered in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In relation to today's topic around early childhood and education, Article 24 talks about the right to inclusive education. This has been something that's been rather controversial. What do we mean by inclusive education? Does it mean we should close all separate, segregated facilities, including those preschool facilities specific to young children with disabilities? And the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has actually said that any form of segregated or specialist provision is a form of discrimination and is in breach of the CRPD. So that is very, very strong language, very controversial political language from the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But we can see what they are working towards. We can see why they are saying that in terms of really pushing mainstream society to make the services more accessible and inclusive for children with disabilities. However, what I find particularly interesting in considering the discussion for this evening is the limited discussion of young children with disabilities, again by the CIPD committee. They haven't discussed the issue in depth. Again, we're seeing some problems in terms of how do we understand the rights of those when we look at the intersectionality. How do we understand in this context the rights of young children with disabilities who are disadvantaged both by their age and by their disability? There has been a reference in the general comments on the right to inclusive education, and the CIPD committee has argued that early childhood interventions can be particularly valuable for children with disabilities, serving to strengthen their capacity to benefit from education and promote their enrolment and attendance. All such interventions must guarantee respect for the dignity and autonomy of the child. State parties are urged to ensure access to quality early childhood development, care and pre-primary education, together with the provision of support and training to parents and caregivers of young children with disability. Again, a conversation that we all need to have is, what does quality early childhood education mean for young children with disability? What does that actually look like? So we can see from that short overview of the CIC and CIPD that very clearly there are a range of rights that apply to young children with disability, that we need to read across rights to understand what they are entitled to and how we can start to put that into practice. But let's look for a moment at rights in practice. What is actually happening in practice when it comes to young children with disabilities and their entitlements? Well, despite these rights being clearly set out, and despite the comments, however small, made by the CIC and CIPD committees, there has been limited progress made across the globe when it comes to looking clearly at the rights of young children with disabilities. We're still very guilty of talking about this population group in terms of need, in terms of services and equipment, rather than their general rights. We can say that rights talk has still been deemed as rather irrelevant and inappropriate to this group of children. They still continue to be seen as in need of protection and care. There continues to be a belief that young children with disabilities have very few, or no, in some cases, views to express. And that has been for many reasons. One of those reasons is that, as I've mentioned, they have no views to express, but that where they may have some views to express, it will be too time-consuming to try and access their views. Or it may be too expensive to try and access their views. So again, we come back to the question of resources. This has been a particular issue for young children with complex needs who may require more support and support that is more expensive, for want of a better word, to use and to access their views. And again, the extent of resources that need to be put in to accessing their views has been viewed as burdensome and unreasonable. There's also been a view that we can access the voices of young children with disability more effectively or more efficiently through adults in their lives, through professionals or through parents. But who is that more effective for? Who is that more efficient for? It may be easier, it may be quicker, it may be cheaper, but is that effective for the young child in question. And the other key reason is adult lack of confidence in engaging with young children with disability. The fear of the unknown in many ways, in terms of what resources may be available, what kind of tools they can use, and finding out what works for the young child with a disability. However, as it's been argued, rights are not supposed to be pointless. They're supposed to yield reasons for action. There's no point having all of these rights on paper if we don't do something with them. There's no point in having them on paper if we as adults don't take some responsibility in finding out and exploring how we can make these rights real for young children with disability, and many of whom are most likely to be more marginalised in our society. Rights are supposed to be about the bare minimum that we can expect. They are about minimum standards and benchmarks. They are not about the maximum. How can we actually do this? How can we turn rights talk into rights action for young children with disabilities? Well, I want to move on now to the final part of the presentation and to provide some insight into what a rights-based participation model might look like for young children with disabilities. I'm sure the majority of you are very familiar with the LINC model of participation that was developed by my colleague, Professor Laura LINC, who's also the other co-director of the Centre for Children's Rights in 2007. And it was developed as a way of enhancing children's right to be heard. It is based on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it's centred around 4 key concepts: the space to express a view, supporting children to express a view, in other words, accessing their voices in different ways, ensuring that when they are expressing a view, they are expressing it to the right audience, and finally, ensuring that the audience they are expressing their view to is able to do something with that view, and that we as adults feed back to children about how their views have been used. The LINC model was created before the adoption of the CIPD, and it's not explicitly targeted at children with disabilities. It is meant to apply to children generally. So Laura and I have been working together to look at what this model might look like in the specific context of disability, including young children with disabilities. We have a more comprehensive illustration of the model than you can see on the screen, and this is currently in development. But for now, I just want to provide you with a little taster of that and a broad overview. When we are considering rights-based participation for young children with disabilities, we need to obviously consider both the CIPD and the CIC. Many of us think about using the CIC alone, and I still read literature that talks about participation for children with disabilities, but makes absolutely no mention of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So this is what I mean in the sense of young children with disabilities falling between 2 schools. In some regard, the CIC has been viewed as being more focused on childhood, and on the other hand, the CIPD has been viewed as being more focused on disability. So we need to try and bring them together and use them in conjunction with each other much more effectively. We have LINC's 4 concepts in the middle, And then to facilitate this in relation to young children with disabilities, we have identified 5 A's. Now, there may possibly be another A or two added to this by the time we have finished, but by now we are considering the 5 A's. So what are these A's? So the first one, acknowledgement. We need to acknowledge children with disabilities as rights holders from the outset. We need to acknowledge that they have capacities in the same ways as other children generally. For young children with disabilities, like children generally, they have the right to evolving capacities, but we need to acknowledge that they do have capacity, they do have rights. Secondly, support provided need to be anticipatory. When we are organising spaces to support children with disabilities to express their views, we should be operating on an assumption that children with disabilities will be involved and therefore make advanced adjustments to facilitate their involvement. Of course, we know that young children with disabilities have very different needs. There's no one-size-all-fits approach. And we need to ensure that we support them to express their views in an accessible way and provide the support that is required, whether that is verbal or non-verbal. We also need to be adaptable. There may be changes that are required as we go along, that requires flexibility, as we would expect with children generally. But in sharing views with the appropriate audience, we should ensure that those views are shared in an adaptable way. That information shared should be child-friendly and appropriate to the audience. That information should also be available in a way that is appropriate to the disability. So that may mean being provided in easy read, in more visual formats, in sign language, if that is appropriate. Attitudes. In sharing views to the appropriate audience, we need to be mindful of the attitude of the appropriate audience towards young children with disability. Are they going to take their views seriously? To what extent are they going to give their views due weight? And then we need to close the circle again by going back to acknowledgement. We need to acknowledge the views that children with disabilities have expressed, and then we need to acknowledge what influence those views have had on the decision-making process and to feed back to them. So I hope that makes some sense in relation to that model, to watch this space in terms of the publication coming out of that. In moving forward then, what are the key points that we need to leave with and think about today? Well, we know that young children with disabilities have been silenced, but unfortunately they continue to be silenced. They continue to be located in protective discourses, and that needs to be challenged. One way of challenging that is using rights-based frameworks. That can shine a spotlight on the inequalities that they experience, on the roots of those inequalities, in challenging prejudices and stereotypes. It's one thing recognising rights, it's one thing reading the rights. We need to move from rights talk to rights action when it comes to young children with disabilities. And that may mean confronting our own biases and our own subjectivities around the issue. A rights-based model of participation is one way of giving effect to rights in practice for young children with disabilities. It's one way of trying to enhance the visibility and the voices of this often marginalised group of young children. I will leave it there for now. I'm happy to take any questions or to feedback on any comments, and I hope you found that useful.
Thanks so much, Bronagh. That was such an insightful presentation on children's rights. I suppose like what's coming back in the chat, the 5As are just amazing, and I suppose it really brings Lundy's model to a whole new level, especially in considering that you were saying that the UNCRC and the rights of the person with disabilities, it's kind of bringing everything together. So it really is finishing the circle. And I suppose you also spoke about what inclusion and quality means and what that looks like within an early childhood setting. And for our students who have completed the LINC programme, they really investigate and interrogate and reflect on what that looks like for them within their setting on their journey to become an inclusion coordinator. We're very lucky within Ireland that we do have frameworks like Ashton and Shielta, which have children's rights and voice embedded within them. And I suppose since the introduction of the access and inclusion model back in 2016 and programmes like LINC and the LINC Plus CPD programme, educators really are being empowered to advocate for the rights of both children and their families, and ensuring that their voices are being heard both in the early childhood setting and further afield, even at policy level. Even in thinking about children who are in receipt of AIM support, the Children's My Inclusion Plan is really written from a child's strengths and a child-centred focus, making sure that we always are seeing the child and their voice first, and then using any strengths and interests that they have to overcome any needs. So I suppose within early childhood, we really are setting the foundations for their educational journey, but also their future journey, and helping them to see that they are advocates and that their voice does matter. So I suppose finally, just to thank Professor Bronagh Byrne, Professor Emer and Dr. Lisha Sullivan for joining us this evening, and also to the LINC team for helping away in the background and helping to organise tonight. And finally, thank you to all of you for giving up your Wednesday evening, your very cold Wednesday evening, and coming along and helping to celebrate International Children's Day with us. We really, really appreciate it.